There was a time when words like Berk, Git and Bampot rolled off the tongue as easily as cheers. These weren't the hard-edged curses you hear today, but everyday insults and expressions that gave British humour its charm. From the playground to the pub, from football terraces to the workplace, these words were part of the soundtrack of life for anyone growing up in the 20th century. In this video, we take a look at 15 forgotten British swear words nobody really uses anymore. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Now let's start off the list. Berk might sound harmless today, but its roots are anything but polite. It comes from Cockney rhyming slang, Berkshire Hunt, which was a stand-in for the C word. Over time, people forgot the original connection, and Berk softened into something more like idiot or fool. It was especially popular in London from the 1950s through the 1970s, often used in schools, pubs, and even by mums telling their kids off. You'd hear things like, "Don't be such a Berk," when someone dropped their chips or did something daft. Its peak was probably the 1960s to 70s, when British sitcoms and comedy shows helped keep it alive. Comedians loved it because it sounded cheeky without being outright offensive, so it slipped past the censors. By the 1990s, younger generations had moved on to stronger insults, leaving Berk behind. Looking back, it's funny how a word that once hid such a rude origin ended up being a playground staple, often used by people who had no idea what it really meant. Pillock is a classic insult from Northern England and Scotland, meaning someone who's stupid or blundering. The word goes back to Old Norse, where it meant penis, so its original bite was much ruder. By the 20th century, though, it was simply a way to call someone an idiot. If you grew up in the North during the 1960s or 70s, you'll remember hearing it in pubs, workplaces, or from your dad when you did something daft, like putting the wrong fuel in the car. It peaked in the 1970s and 80s, appearing on TV shows and in working-class banter. Comedians on programs like The Two Ronnies or Only Fools and Horses used it to get laughs without causing outrage. A typical line might be, "You daft Pillock, you've gone and broken it again." It was popular with blokes down the pub and women telling their husbands off in kitchens up and down the country. Today, it sounds almost affectionate compared to the swearing that's common now, but for many over 50s, it brings back a smile. Before Muppet became associated only with Kermit and Miss Piggy, it was a sharp little British insult in the 1970s and 80s. Calling someone a Muppet meant they were useless, clumsy, or just plain daft. The exact origin is debated, but it's thought to have come from football terraces and working-class slang, quickly spreading thanks to the popularity of The Muppet Show on British TV. The show gave it a playful edge, and so the word caught on with kids and adults alike. It peaked in the 1980s, particularly in London and the North. "You Muppet" was a common shout at school, on the building site, or even on the football pitch when someone missed an open goal. The insult carried just enough sting to show annoyance, but it was also funny, making it perfect for banter. Teachers sometimes used it in class to keep things light, and parents might scold their kids with it while trying not to laugh. By the 1990s, it started fading, but for many, it's still a word that brings back memories of Saturday night, telly, and cheeky playground chatter. Git was once a serious put-down, sharper than it sounds now. It comes from a 19th century dialect word for get, meaning a child or offspring, often said with disgust. By the mid-20th century, it was firmly an insult in Britain, describing someone who was nasty, irritating, or generally unpleasant. Unlike Pillock or Muppet, which leaned more towards silly, calling someone a git had more venom. It was most popular in the 1960s through 1980s, particularly in England. You'd hear it in pubs, schools, and even on television. In fact, Monty Python gave it extra life with sketches where characters would shout things like, "You selfish git." It was often used by working-class blokes, but it spread widely thanks to British comedy. A rotten git or stupid git was the kind of phrase you'd hear from your mum when she was cross, or from your mates after you let the team down. By the 1990s, it had lost its edge and now feels almost quaint, but for many, it recalls an era when insults could sting without going over the line. Bampot is pure Scottish slang, and it means someone who's daft, foolish, or completely off their rocker. The word combines bam, meaning a fool or clown, possibly linked to bambino, with pot, suggesting a container for madness, like crackpot. It was used mostly in Scotland from the 1950s through the 1980s, though it occasionally made its way south in jokes and comedy sketches. It peaked in the 1970s and 80s, often heard on the streets of Glasgow and Edinburgh, shouted during football matches or bantered around pubs. "Ya bampot" was a phrase with plenty of bite but also humour, since it was often said with a laugh rather than real malice. Kids would use it in the playground, while grown-ups might use it when someone had a few too many and made a fool of themselves. Scottish comedians like Billy Connolly helped spread it, keeping it alive in the public ear. For many over 50s, Bampot is one of those warm, cheeky words that reminds them of nights out, rowdy football chants, and the kind of humour only Scots can deliver. Wazzock is one of those words that could only have come from the north of England. It's a playful but cutting way of calling someone a complete idiot. The word itself likely comes from dialect, with was meaning to urinate, giving it that crude, earthy feel. If someone was a Wazzock, they weren't just a bit silly, they were a prize fool, the sort who'd pour tea into the sugar bowl or trip over their own shoelaces. It was most popular in the 1970s and 80s, especially in Yorkshire and Lancashire. You'd hear it down the pub when a mate said something daft, or on the terraces at football matches. "You daft Wazzock" was a phrase shouted across countless kitchens and playgrounds. It had a real comic punch and comedians loved it, often using it on TV to get a laugh without shocking audiences. Chuffer is a bit of a forgotten gem, mostly used in Yorkshire and parts of the north. It was a soft swear word, standing in for stronger language. Depending on the tone, it could mean idiot or simply be a mild expletive when something went wrong. For example, if you dropped your pint, you might mutter, "Oh, chuffer." Parents liked it because it gave kids something to say that wasn't too rude, but still let them blow off steam. Its heyday was in the 1960s and 70s, especially in working-class towns, where regional dialects stayed strong. It didn't travel far beyond Yorkshire, which might be why it faded out by the 1990s. You'd hear it on the shop floor, in the playground, or muttered by dads fixing cars. It was the kind of word you could get away with in front of your gran, which made it a safe option in families that frowned on swearing. Numpty is one of those Scottish words that made its way into wider British slang. It means a fool, someone clumsy or clueless, and it carries a mix of mockery and affection. Its origins are thought to come from Scots dialect in the 20th century, with nump meaning stupid. By the 1970s and 80s, it was common in Scotland, and thanks to comedians and football culture, it spread south. It peaked in the 1980s, often shouted on football terraces or used in pubs after someone made a daft mistake. "You numpty" was the kind of thing you'd say when a mate locked his keys in the car or spilt his pint. It was used by parents and teachers too, as a way to scold without being too harsh. By the 1990s, it had softened even more and became almost affectionate. Daft Apeth is pure northern charm. It literally means daft halfpenny, with Apeth being a dialect word for halfpenny. It was a way of saying someone was silly, foolish, or scatterbrained. Unlike harsher insults, it was often said with a smile, almost affectionate, like calling someone a silly sausage today. It was most popular from the 1950s through the 1970s, particularly in Yorkshire and Lancashire. Parents often used it with children, like saying, "You daft Apeth, look what you've done," when something got knocked over or forgotten. It also appeared in workplaces, especially in factories and mills, where light-hearted banter kept spirits up. You might also remember hearing it on classic British TV, as it fit right in with the humour of shows like Coronation Street or Last of the Summer Wine. By the 1990s, it was already sounding old-fashioned, but for those who grew up with it, Daft Apeth is a reminder of warm kitchens, busy streets, and the way Northerners could insult you and care about you at the same time. Sod is one of those words that feels mild today, but it once carried real sting. It comes from sodomite, and in earlier centuries it was deeply offensive. By the mid-20th century, though, it had softened into everyday slang, used to mean an irritating person or as an exclamation of frustration. Sod off was a phrase shouted in playgrounds, pubs and workplaces across Britain, especially from the 1950s through the 1980s. Its peak came in the 1960s and 70s, when it slipped into TV and comedy shows as a cheeky way to swear without crossing the line. It was especially popular in working-class areas, where sod this or lazy sod were part of daily speech. Parents used it when telling off kids, mates used it in jest, and it could even sound affectionate. Poor sod was often said about someone unlucky. Though younger generations rarely use it now, for many over 50s, sod recalls a time when swearing had its own hierarchy, and this word sat perfectly in the middle. Pranny was a sharp insult mostly heard in the north of England, particularly Yorkshire and the northeast. It originally came from a slang word for female anatomy, which made it quite rude in its day. Over time, though, it was watered down into something closer to idiot or fool, though it still had a bit of bite. It was most commonly used in the 1960s to 80s, often in school playgrounds and on the terraces at football matches. "You daft pranny" was a favourite line when someone made a silly mistake, like tripping over their own feet or scoring an own goal. It was never really polite company material, but it wasn't so harsh that it couldn't slip into everyday banter. By the 1990s, it had all but disappeared, replaced by newer slang. Wally was a hugely popular insult in the 1970s and 80s, particularly in London and the South. It simply meant a fool, a clumsy or clueless person. The origin is uncertain. Some say it came from seaside postcards, others from football chants, but by the mid-70s it was everywhere. The classic example was when crowds at rock concerts started shouting "Wally" during lulls, turning it into a national craze. It quickly spread into everyday language. Kids in schools loved it, parents used it in scoldings, and you'd hear it in sitcoms and comedy sketches. "You Wally" was perfect for moments when someone did something daft, like putting salt in their tea instead of sugar. Its peak was the 70s, but it lingered well into the 80s before fading. Divvy is pure Liverpool and Merseyside slang, though it travelled around the north. It meant a fool, an idiot, or someone who couldn't be trusted to do a job properly. The word comes from dividend, used in cooperatives to describe members' shares, but locals twisted it into slang for someone simple or clumsy. It was most common in the 1960s through the 80s. In Liverpool playgrounds, you'd often hear "You Divvy" shouted at kids who dropped the ball or mucked up a game. In workplaces, it was a common bit of banter between colleagues. It had just enough sting to make someone blush, but was still used jokingly more often than not. Mersey beat culture and Scouse comedians helped keep it alive, and many Liverpudlians over 50 will remember it fondly. By the 1990s, it had faded outside the region, but for those who grew up with it, Divvy remains a slice of proper northern character. Clot was a classic British insult throughout much of the 20th century, though it feels very old-fashioned today. It meant a blockhead, a fool, or someone lacking common sense. The word itself goes back centuries, clot meaning a lump, as in clot of blood. So calling someone a clot was like calling them a lump of stupidity. It was especially common in the 1950s to 70s, used in schools, households, and by authority figures who wanted to scold without being vulgar. Teachers might snap "You clot" if you dropped your books or forgot your homework. Parents used it in kitchens and living rooms across Britain, and it even slipped into early TV shows, where stronger language wasn't allowed. It peaked before the 1980s, then started to fade as edgier insults took over. For many over 50s, though, Clot still carries that nostalgic ring of childhood scoldings and gentler times when being called a fool was firm but never cruel. Ninny is one of the oldest insults on the list, and by the mid-20th century, it already sounded a bit old-fashioned. It means a simpleton, a silly or foolish person. The word goes back centuries. Shakespeare even used it, which shows how deeply it sat in English. By the 1950s and 60s, Ninny was often used by parents, teachers, and grandparents to scold kids in a way that was more affectionate than cruel. It was most common in middle-class households and in schools where politeness mattered. "Don't be such a ninny" was the kind of phrase you'd hear when someone was fussing, worrying too much, or making a small mistake into a big drama. It peaked in popularity before the 1970s, but lingered on as a gentle scolding term into the 80s. By the 1990s, it had all but disappeared from everyday speech, remembered more from children's books and old films than real life. For over 50s, though, it might bring back the voices of parents and grandparents, and a time when even insults were softer, often wrapped up with a smile. And that's it for today's trip down memory lane. Give it a like if you remembered some words from your past, or if you still say them today. And don't forget to subscribe for more information and nostalgia. See you next time.